We need a little darkness to appreciate the light.
Dark was the night. The same sounds moved through my ears. The rumbling of city trains went with the familiar sight of dim street lights and streetwalkers. Everything was different at night. The morrow is a different world. When light shines, it holds darkness back. But eventually, the light goes down, and darkness comes. Darkness brings mystery. Mystery brings fear. Fear brings opportunity. The beasts come out at night, dark figures feeding on the weak. It's always the same. I fixed my overcoat as I walked among the used needles that decorated the floor. The moonlight made the concrete floor glow an eerie white. I stopped walking as I admired the sky. The stars were out, the shining crystals of stardust that made any synthetic glow envious. I closed my eyes and I listened. The scattered sounds penetrated my ears as the smell joined with it. If I were to lose my sight, I'd always know where I am. The city has its own idiosyncratic fragrance. The city was something all of my senses could see, but with beauty. There is corruption. If Jesus were to step down today, chances are he'd leave. The scum of man covered everything, leaving a sick feeling in my stomach. The apotheosis of all cynicism spread everywhere. The bastardizing need to fight, to survive, spread corruption and a feeling of apathy. When people become apathetic, they stop fighting. The corruption runs through their veins as their will to fight remains lethargic. I breathe in heavily as the distant cries of a woman echoed in my eardrums like the endless falsetto of 1,600 men. Criminality, perversion, degeneracy, and debauchery were the words that reminded me most of this oasis of filth. The cries grew louder as I traveled closer. I kept walking as I felt nothing else except pure antipathy. I reached the source of the scene. My eyes glowed with luminosity as I stood. An alley was in front of me. I could see a woman dressed in a black tank top and shorts that were too short. Two men were pushing her up against the wall. as her expression changed to a look of pure panic. One of the men noticed me. I looked back at him. Before I put on a white mask, it was decorated with a fear-inducing smile and terrible stitches. The men let the woman go. Silence infected the alley like an unstoppable infection. I stepped towards them. Two wolves feeding on sheep are interrupted by a bear. The city we deem civilized is as wild as the isolated forests. You want to mess with her? Why don't you try messing with me? I screamed like a madman as I stepped towards them. One of them ran at me. He carried a sharp knife. Time seemed to move slow. I rushed him when he was in arm's reach. His eyes widened when I gripped his throat. I pulled as hard as I could, and I heard a giant rip. The man's throat opened with a giant tear as warm blood sprayed across my face. I stared into his eyes, and he looked at me back. His expression was distraught. I smirked before I let out a devilish laugh. The other man put his hands up. He asked for mercy. I wasn't gonna give it to him. I kept stepping towards him. He shook his head and ran at me. He struck me in the face. I turned my head and I looked back at him. I snarled and tackled him. I straddled him before gripping his head. His face was frightened, and his eyes widened as he tries to push me off him. I ignored his attempts, and I slammed his head against the floor. Blood decorated the concrete as tremors of impact shot through my arm. I laughed hysterically as I slammed his head repeatedly on the ground. He finally stopped. The man's expression was empty. And a pool of blood formed around his temple. Feeling was surreal. I wiped my fingers against my mask, and I looked up, ignoring the woman that was sitting in front of me. The satisfaction of these moments makes me wonder if I'm more of a monster than the people I kill.